What happens when Hollywood's most respected veteran actor meets late-night television's biggest ego, and things go completely sideways? Tonight we're diving into the explosive confrontation that had Don Johnson storming off the Jimmy Kimmel Live set, leaving audiences stunned and the host scrambling to save face. This is the untold story of how a routine promotional interview turned into television's most uncomfortable moment of the year. Make sure to subscribe and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe how this unfolds. Don Johnson walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel Live set that Tuesday evening with the confidence of a man who had conquered both television and film for over 4 decades. The Miami Vice legend was there to promote his latest Netflix series, a gritty crime drama that had critics calling it his career-defining performance. What should have been a straightforward 10-minute segment about his new show quickly devolved into something entirely different. Kimmel opened with his typical smug grin, the kind that suggested he already knew something his guest didn't. "Don Johnson, everybody," he announced to the studio audience as they applauded. "Now, Don, I have to ask, at your age, are you still trying to be the cool guy from Miami Vice? Or have you finally accepted that the 80s are over?" The question landed with an uncomfortable thud. Johnson's smile faltered for just a moment, but he recovered quickly. "Well, Jimmy, I think cool is timeless. Unlike some comedy shows that rely on cheap shots instead of actual wit." The audience shifted in their seats. This wasn't the playful banter they were used to. Kimmel's laugh felt forced as he leaned back in his chair. "Oh, we're starting with the zingers already? I like that. But seriously, your new show, it's pretty dark stuff. Are you trying to prove you're more than just a pretty face in a white suit?" Johnson's jaw tightened slightly. "I've been proving that for 40 years, Jimmy. Maybe if you did your homework instead of relying on your writers to feed you questions, you'd know I've had a pretty diverse career." The tension in the studio was palpable now. Kimmel's producers, behind the cameras, were making frantic hand gestures, but their host seemed determined to push forward. "Wow, okay, somebody's a little sensitive tonight. Look, I get it, aging in Hollywood is tough, but do you really think this new show is going to remind people why they should care about Don Johnson in 2024? That was the moment everything changed. Johnson leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping to that familiar Miami Vice growl that had made him famous. "You know what, Jimmy? I came here tonight to talk about a project I'm passionate about, to share something meaningful with your audience. But instead, you want to play this tired game where you try to tear down your guests to make yourself feel relevant." Kimmel's smile was becoming more strained by the second. "Hey now, that's not what I'm doing. This is late-night television. We have fun here. We joke around." "No," Johnson interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "What you do is invite successful people onto your show so you can try to diminish their achievements. It makes you feel bigger, doesn't it? Like you're somehow on their level because you can make them uncomfortable on national television." The studio audience was dead silent now. Some were pulling out their phones, sensing they were witnessing something that would be all over social media within hours. Kimmel's writers were frantically scribbling notes, trying to come up with damage control. "Don, come on. You're being a little dramatic here," Kimmel said, his voice taking on a patronizing tone that only made things worse. "I'm just having a conversation. This is what talk shows do." Johnson stood up abruptly, his microphone still clipped to his jacket. "No, Jimmy, this is what bad talk shows do. Good hosts actually care about their guests and their work. They don't use interview time to work through their own insecurities." The camera operators weren't sure where to focus. Some stayed on Johnson, others panned to Kimmel, who was now visibly flustered. His famous quick wit seemed to have abandoned him completely. "Sit down, Don. We're in the middle of a show here," Kimmel said, trying to regain control of the situation. "I'm sitting down," Johnson replied coolly, even though he was clearly standing. "Oh, wait. No, I'm not. Just like I'm not going to sit here and be your punching bag for your amusement." Kimmel's face was reddening now. "You're making this way More dramatic than it needs to be. I ask tough questions. That's my job. Your job, Johnson said, pointing directly at his host, is supposed to be entertainment. But there's nothing entertaining about watching a grown man try to boost his own ego by belittling his guests. You want to know what's not cool, Jimmy? This. This right here. The audience was starting to murmur among themselves. Some were clearly uncomfortable, others seemed thrilled to be witnessing what felt like television history in the making. Kimmel's band leader was looking around nervously, unsure whether he should start playing music to try to lighten the mood. Look, if you can't handle a few jokes, maybe late-night television isn't for you, Kimmel shot back, his voice getting sharper. This is how these shows work, Don. We've been doing this for years. Johnson laughed, but there was no humor in it. Years of what, Jimmy? Years of making your guests feel unwelcome? Years of mistaking cruelty for comedy? Because that's not what Johnny Carson did. That's not what David Letterman did. They elevated their guests. They didn't try to tear them down. The comparison to the late-night legends clearly stung. Kimmel's face went from red to nearly purple. Don't you dare compare me to them. And don't lecture me about how to do my job when you're having a meltdown on my stage. Meltdown? Johnson's voice was incredulous. Jimmy, I'm the calmest person in this room right now. You're the one who's sweating through your makeup because your little game backfired. The camera caught Kimmel unconsciously touching his forehead, where indeed beads of perspiration were becoming visible under the studio lights. The audience was now completely invested in this real-life drama unfolding before them. We need to go to commercial, Kimmel said, looking off stage toward his producers. No, Johnson said firmly. We need to finish this conversation, because your audience deserves to see what kind of host you really are when the script doesn't go your way. Kimmel's producers were making cutting motions across their throats, but their host seemed paralyzed by the situation spiraling beyond his control. The audience could sense the raw authenticity of the moment, something rarely seen in the scripted world of late-night television. You want to finish this conversation? Kimmel said, his voice cracking slightly. Fine. Let's talk about why you're really here, Don. Your new show is getting terrible reviews. The network is already talking about canceling it. Maybe that's why you're so defensive tonight. The studio went completely silent. Even the camera operators stopped moving. Johnson's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture. He took a step closer to Kimmel's desk. Now that's interesting, Jimmy. Where exactly did you hear that? Because I just left a meeting with the network executives this afternoon, and they're thrilled with the numbers. In fact, they're already talking about season 2. Kimmel's confidence wavered. Well, I have sources in the industry. People talk. People talk, Johnson repeated slowly. Or maybe you're just making things up because you thought it would get a reaction. That's your specialty, isn't it? Creating drama where none exists. The host was now fidgeting with his tie, a nervous habit his regular viewers would recognize. I don't make things up, Don. I report what I hear. From who? Johnson pressed. Name one source. Give me one executive, one critic, one person who told you my show was in trouble. Kimmel's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally he managed, I don't reveal my sources, because you don't have any, Johnson said matter-of-factly. You just threw out a lie hoping it would hurt me, hoping it would make me look foolish on your show. That's not journalism, Jimmy. That's not even good gossip. That's just mean-spirited nonsense. The audience was starting to turn. A few people were actually booing, and it wasn't directed at Johnson. Kimmel seemed to realize he was losing the room. Look, Don, I think we got off on the wrong foot here, he said, attempting to salvage the situation. Why don't we start over? Tell us about your new show. Johnson shook his head slowly. No, Jimmy, you don't get to do that. You don't get to attack someone and then pretend it was all a misunderstanding when it doesn't go your way. That's not how real conversations work. This is television, Don. Sometimes we have to move things along. This is your television show, Johnson corrected. And you've chosen to use it as a platform to humiliate people. Do you think that's entertaining? Do you think your audience enjoys watching you try to destroy someone's career for laughs? Kimmel looked out at his audience, many of whom were now looking uncomfortable or actively disapproving. I'm not trying to destroy anyone's career. That's ridiculous. Then what would you call spreading false information about someone's professional life? What would you call trying to make them look washed up and irrelevant? Because from where I'm standing, that sounds exactly like what you're trying to do. The host was now visibly sweating, dabbing at his forehead with a tissue his assistant had quietly handed him. I ask challenging questions. That's what good interviewers do. Good interviewers ask informed questions, Johnson shot back. They do research. They care about accuracy. They don't just throw out random accusations hoping something sticks. What you did wasn't challenging, Jimmy. It was lazy and dishonest. Kimmel's voice was getting higher, more defensive. I've been doing this show for years. I know how to conduct an interview. Do you? Johnson asked. Because from what I've seen tonight, you know how to ambush people. You know how to make them uncomfortable. But I haven't seen any evidence that you actually know how to have a real conversation with another human being. The audience was now completely silent, hanging on every word. This wasn't the usual late-night comedy banter. This was a real confrontation between two men, and one was clearly winning. You're being incredibly unfair, Kimmel protested. I bring guests on this show to have fun, to promote their projects, to entertain people. No, Johnson said firmly. You bring guests on this show to make yourself feel important, to convince yourself and everyone else that you belong in the same room as people who've actually accomplished something meaningful. That hit home. Kimmel's face contorted with anger. Who do you think you are? You had one hit show 30 years ago and you think that makes you some kind of legend? There it is, Johnson said, almost smiling. There's the real Jimmy Kimmel. Not the fake nice guy persona, not the scripted jokes. Just a bitter man who resents anyone who's achieved something he hasn't. The audience was now openly uncomfortable. Some were looking at their phones. Others were whispering to each other. This had gone far beyond entertainment into something much more personal and ugly. I've achieved plenty, Kimmel said through gritted teeth. I have a successful show. I've won awards. I'm respected in this industry. Are you? Johnson asked quietly. Because right now, in front of your own audience, you're falling apart because someone finally called you out on your behavior. Is this what success looks like to you, Jimmy? Attacking your guests when you can't think of anything intelligent to say? Kimmel stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward. I think this interview is over. I think you're right, Johnson agreed. But not because you're ending it, because you never actually started it. An interview requires two people having a conversation. What you do is perform a one-man show where you use other people as props. The host was now pacing behind his desk, his composure completely shattered. Get off my stage, Don. This is my show, and I want you to leave. Johnson remained perfectly calm. Is this how you handle all your problems, Jimmy? When things don't go according to your script, you just throw people out? That's very mature of you. Security, Kimmel called out, his voice cracking. Security? Johnson laughed genuinely for the first time all evening. Jimmy, I'm a 60-year-old actor who's been nothing but polite to you all night. What exactly do you think security is going to do? Arrest me for disagreeing with you? The audience was now openly murmuring, some laughing at the absurdity of calling security on Don Johnson. Even Kimmel seemed to realize how ridiculous he looked. Just leave, he said quietly, his earlier bravado completely gone. Oh, I'm leaving, Johnson assured him. But not because you're throwing me out. I'm leaving because this has been the most unprofessional, disrespectful interview experience I've had in 4 decades of doing television. And that's saying something. He began unclipping his microphone, his movements deliberate and calm. You know what the saddest part is, Jimmy? You had a chance tonight to have a real conversation with someone who's been in this business longer than you've been alive. Someone who could have shared stories, insights, experiences that your audience might have actually enjoyed. Instead, you chose to play your little power games. Kimmel was now slumped in his chair, looking defeated. Don, please, can we just finish the segment? There's nothing to finish, Johnson replied, handing his microphone to a stagehand. You ended this interview the moment you decided to attack me instead of talking to me. The only difference is, I'm the one with enough dignity to walk away. The studio audience watched in stunned silence as Johnson straightened his jacket and prepared to leave. But he wasn't quite finished. He turned back to face Kimmel one final time, and what he said next would become the most talked-about moment in late-night television history. You know, Jimmy, I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about aging in Hollywood being tough. You're absolutely right. It is tough, but not for the reasons you think. Kimmel looked up from his defeated posture, perhaps hoping Johnson was about to apologize or make peace. He was wrong. It's tough because you have to watch people like you take over the industry, Johnson continued, his voice carrying clearly through the silent studio. People who think cynicism is the same as intelligence. People who mistake cruelty for wit. People who have no respect for the craft, for the history, or for the human beings who came before them. The camera was fixed on Johnson now, and he seemed to be speaking not just to Kimmel, but to everyone watching. I've worked with some of the greatest talents this industry has ever produced. Directors who changed cinema, actors who defined generations, writers who created magic with words, and every single one of them understood something you clearly don't. What's that? Kimmel asked quietly, almost involuntarily. That this business is about lifting people up, not tearing them down. It's about creating something beautiful together, not destroying each other for entertainment. Johnson took a step closer to Kimmel's desk. You sit behind this desk every night, and you think you're the star of the show. But the truth is, Jimmy, you're just the guy who introduces the real talent. The people who actually create things, who take risks, who put themselves out there to make art. And instead of celebrating that, instead of being grateful that they're willing to share their time with you, you use them as targets for your insecurities. The silence in the studio was deafening. Even the crew members had stopped what they were doing to listen. I feel sorry for you, Johnson said, and somehow that was more devastating than any insult could have been. Because you'll never know what it feels like to truly collaborate with someone, to build something meaningful together. All you know how to do is tear down what others have built. Kimmel's voice was barely above a whisper. Don, I was just trying to be funny. No, you weren't, Johnson replied firmly. You were trying to make yourself feel bigger by making me feel smaller. That's not comedy, Jimmy. That's just sad. He looked out at the audience, many of whom were now openly staring at Kimmel with disappointment. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that you had to witness this tonight. You came here expecting to be entertained, and instead you got to see what happens when someone forgets that television is supposed to serve the audience, not the ego of the host. Johnson began walking toward the exit, but Kimmel's voice stopped. Him. Wait, Don, please, we can edit this. We can start over. Nobody has to see this. Johnson turned around slowly, and for the first time all evening, he looked genuinely surprised. Edit this? Jimmy, this is the most honest your show has been in years. This is the first time your audience has seen the real you, not the character you play. Why would you want to hide that? Because it makes me look bad, Kimmel admitted, his voice cracking. No, Jimmy, your behavior made you look bad. The cameras just recorded it. The host was now openly pleading. Come on, Don, sit back down. Let's talk about your show. I promise I'll be respectful. Johnson studied him for a long moment. You know what the difference is between us, Jimmy? When I make a mistake, I own it. I learn from it. I don't try to pretend it never happened or blame someone else for my choices. He gestured toward the audience. These people paid money to come here tonight. They arranged babysitters. They took time off work. They got dressed up and came to see a show. And what did you give them? A masterclass in how not to treat another human being. Kimmel was now visibly crying, though he was trying to hide it. I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry. I was having a bad day and I took it out on you. There it is, Johnson said, but his tone wasn't triumphant. It was almost gentle. That's all it would have taken, Jimmy. A little honesty. A little humanity. But you had to wait until you were completely humiliated before you could admit you were wrong. The audience was now completely invested in this moment of raw human drama. Some were wiping away tears themselves, moved by the genuine emotion they were witnessing. Look at your audience, Johnson said, gesturing toward the seats. Look at their faces. They're not angry at you because you had a bad day. They're disappointed because you chose to handle it by hurting someone else. Kimmel looked out at his audience and seemed to truly see them for the first time all evening. Their expressions ranged from disappointment to disgust to pity. I don't know how to fix this, Kimmel said quietly. Start by being honest, Johnson replied. Stop hiding behind jokes and personas and scripted bits. Be a real person talking to other real people. Treat your guests like human beings instead of entertainment commodities. He paused at the edge of the stage. And maybe, just maybe, remember that everyone who comes on this show is someone's son or daughter, someone's parent, someone's friend. They have feelings, they have dignity, and they deserve basic respect. Johnson looked directly into the main camera. To everyone watching at home, thank you for your time tonight. I hope you'll check out my new show, not because a talk show host recommends it, but because it's a story worth telling, created by people who believe in the power of good storytelling. He turned back to Kimmel one last time. Jimmy, I genuinely hope you learn something from this. Not for your career, not for your ratings, but for your own sake. Because the person you were tonight isn't someone you should be proud of. And with that, Don Johnson walked off the Jimmy Kimmel Live stage, leaving behind a host who finally understood what it meant to be truly humbled. The audience sat in stunned silence as Kimmel stared at his desk, unable to meet their eyes. The cameras kept rolling as Kimmel struggled to find words, any words, to salvage what was left of the show. But sometimes, the most powerful television happens when there's nothing left to say. The band didn't play him out. There was no joke to lighten the mood. There was just the sound of Don Johnson's footsteps echoing through the studio as he walked, away from what would become the most talked-about interview disaster in late-night television history. And in that silence, everyone in the room learned something about dignity, respect, and what happens when entertainment forgets its humanity. That's the untold story of the night Don Johnson exposed Jimmy Kimmel for who he really was, not through anger or revenge, but through simple, devastating honesty. Make sure to subscribe for more behind-the-scenes stories that the mainstream media won't tell you, and comment below with your thoughts. What do you think really drives someone to treat their guests so poorly? Let me know in the comments.